Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 5. We are here with Dr. Tracy Bear, Dr. Paul Garrow. We have a very special guest this week, which I'm very happy to have with us. We have Tanya Harnett. Tanya, welcome to the group discussion. We're so happy to have you here. Do you want to just tell everybody watching a little bit about what you do and why you're here today?
Yes, I'm a professor in art and design and a joint appointment with Native Studies, which is fantastic. It's a great combination for me. I am First Nations. I come from the Carry the Kettle Reserve, and I'm here because I have done a little bit of research and work on residential schools. My family has 3 generations in the experience of residential schools. My great-grandfather, my grandfather, my mother, and all those siblings and whatnot in between. So, of course, which affects me as a intergenerational person and my kids and their grandkids. So, yeah.
Yeah, we're really lucky to have Tanya associated with the faculty, and really happy to have you here, Tanya.
Thank you.
So,
Yeah, I think so too.
Shall we start off with our smudge this morning?
Absolutely.
As per usual, it's amazing sage that I got from Batoche in Saskatchewan last year in the final Walking with Our Sisters, which we touch a little bit on actually today in our discussion. And for you, everyone out there, a nice good smudge
Can you
to start. Oh yeah. To start our day. Hey, I've smudged backhoes. It's you can smudge anything.
Yes.
To start ourselves off in a good way with this spiritual cleansing of this sweet medicine that we've been provided for, and hopefully, people listening, people watching will come to this with good eyes and good intentions, and then our thoughts and our discussions come with good intentions and good heart work. Hi.
Hi. Merci, Tracy.
All right.
It was quite a week. It was quite a lesson.
Yes, Dan, how did you do this week? Like, not just on your tests or anything, but like
No.
emotional. How was your heart?
My heart, I mean, it can't help obviously but break for the extreme injustices and the disruption of communities and culture in terms of what these residential schools acted to do, and the fact that the country was behind this and was behind the idea that separating families and essentially erasing and eradicating culture was a good idea. I mean, it's absolutely appalling. And I think the big takeaway, as so many of these weeks have sort of illuminated for so many of us, is just the importance of education and the importance of a very detailed education when it comes to these types of things, and how important it is that we continue to re-educate ourselves when it comes to these injustices, because I think so much of the fight gets kind of knocked out of people because they get farther and farther away from it. And there was something, I'm going to just pull it up. There was something in the New York Times that I thought kind of, in a way pertained to this, because I think a big takeaway for me was just how important it is that we continue to educate And this is not in any way comparing, but it is an example of what happens when people forget and when the education is not at the forefront of people's minds. And this was from the New York Times about the Holocaust. There was a statistic that was run in America, and the result was that 31% of Americans and 41% of millennials believe that 2 million or fewer Jews were killed in the Holocaust. The actual number is around 6 million. 41% of Americans and 66% of millennials cannot say what Auschwitz was. And 52% of Americans wrongly think Hitler came to power through force. So this is by no means comparing anything at this point, but rather the idea and the importance of education. Yeah. Because you look at something like residential schools, which is such a horrendous thing, such a stain on the Canadian on Canadian history, and yet I would be very interested to know whether the majority of Canadians have the information that was required and reported on in this week's lesson. I would be very curious, because I think if more Canadians had this information, more Canadians would be acting on the rage that they feel for what happened in their own country.
Mm-hmm. It's actually really quite surprising, and I think Tanya and Paul would probably agree. When you're teaching first-year university students, you know, even if I'm teaching contemporary Indigenous art, residential schools comes up. And I'm always surprised at how many students are shocked. They go through this whole shock and denial and then this anger, you know, in the space of a class. So you're trying to teach one thing and you're like, I thought you guys would have covered this. It's amazing how many haven't.
Maybe I'll go through that brief introduction about the history, just very short. So in 1857, the Gradual Civilization Act was passed by the province of Canada in order to assimilate Indigenous peoples. The establishment of the Department of Indian Affairs was in 1880. And Duncan Campbell Scott, who came in as deputy superintendent for Department of Indian Affairs, was 1913 to 1932. And in 1820, Bill 14 was passed, amending the Indian Act to establish day, industrial, and boarding schools. My great-grandfather went in 1886, and really the first, that was the first residential school in Western Canada. So I pulled up the history of the bill.
Mm-hmm. There it is.
Yeah.
That changed everything for First Nations people, changed history, changed the way everybody thinks for multiple generations. So I can't say how much this affects absolutely every aspect of Indigenous people's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess that leads into the question that, you know, maybe a lot of people are wondering, why study this history? Why look at residential schools? What has it got to do with me now?
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts, Paul?
Yeah, well, so the way that the modules, and I think the MOOC is quite genius, actually. Thank you, Tracy. Because it builds up, right? It starts with this, like the way we've been seeing it, starts with this statement of worldview, like of epistemology, of Indigenous epistemologies and nations, right? So this sovereignty, this is about Indigenous sovereignty. And then we speak about how the state becomes more and more sort of like present and overbearing, really, like how the Crown relations with Indigenous nations is something real, but that gets forgotten with the Canadian state. And what Tanya is talking about, it's like Tanya from sorry, okay. What she's talking about, it's from the start that this that Indigenous people have to be civilized, right? So so it's like it's ingrained into our story about Canada, but we never know about it, and settler Canadians never understand because it's so part of the DNA. So this module in particular is strong because it frames it as Indigenous sovereignty first. And this is super important to realize, like that the first section about observational learning, 7 generations in inductive discipline, is what you should walk away with, ultimately, you know? And the section 2 about residential schooling is about institutionalization and how brutal that is. And that's in the DNA of Canadian citizenship, right? Mm-hmm. So those are lessons that we have to walk away with, but we always have to center Indigenous sovereignty and the fact that Indigenous peoples, like of all nations, can raise their children right. They've always raised their children in a right way.
Yeah. That's a really good point to mention, Paul. And it was it wasn't so much a struggle to have that, but I think so many of us are ingrained in thinking about history, especially as an Indigenous person, from a deficit model. And so we really wanted this MOOC to aspire to start with the Indigenous worldview, really found it in that, and tell people how our ideologies and worldviews affect everything, and then talk about the colonization and the influence of the Western state. It's always important to make that foundation. So thanks for that, Paul.
Yeah, for sure. Because it's in the MOOC. It's in our learning.
It laid the cultural sort of foundation for people to understand just how significant and disruptive the residential school concept was to the prioritization of storytelling within the communities, because you're realizing that so much of the history, so much of the culture, so much of the education gets passed down from generation to generation, that disrupting that pattern, disrupting that cultural sort of passing of information is, I mean, aside from being absolutely heartbreaking, it is just it is the most corrosive thing you can do in this particular sort of world. So that really was, I think, so significant to have that understanding going into this, because in terms of my education through this, that was really kind of, as I was reading, I was saying, well, wait, this actually is actively going against every principle that these communities have stood for in terms of how they live their lives and the education and the prioritization of wisdom and community and how that gets passed down. I mean, it's absolutely disgusting. And
children were ripped from their homes. Quite literally. There was legal standing for the officers to come and pull these kids out, and they had 3 days before they could. If they didn't have the kids out in 3 days, they were warned that their parents might be arrested. So it's really traumatic because they're ripped out of their homes at young age. My mother was taken out at 4 and shipped off to another province. So when that happens, you don't have the understanding of the parenting or the grandparents. You don't understand language, food, song, story. It's all taken away.
Yeah. So, Paul, you have a nice little button. Do you wanna talk about that gorgeous piece of art?
Thank you. Yeah, it's sparkly. It's sparkly on my U of A, my University of Alberta black thing. So this is a orange shirt. So for those in the US, I guess, in Canada, in many places, I know Edmonton has, but we've instituted Orange Shirt Day as a commemoration of residential school and part of this public education and commemoration and remembering, right? So it has to do with Phyllis Webstat, who was a young First Nations person who was wearing an orange shirt going into residential school, and they took it off of her. And I think the symbolism behind it is that this is something beautiful that was gifted to her and she was proud of, and that this sort of like forced assimilation and sort of pushing down of that identity and all of the things that come with it, all that coerciveness, it shouldn't have happened. So we wear these orange shirts to remember that and to affirm that this is important, that Indigenous collectivity is really important, that we should remember this for a good reason.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
And that's on September 30th, hey, Paul?
September 30th. And I got this pin at the Lac St. Anne pilgrimage, which is a really big pilgrimage for all Indigenous, a lot of Indigenous nations. They go there to visit and have fun and buy stuff at the market, which is really good.
Yeah. So we'll put a link when Sarah puts together the reading list and resources, so for people to see that a little bit more.
Any people out there who would want to get on board in terms of supporting that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's I did something for the magazine at the university as well, talking about our Orange Shirt Day, and I can give you the link for that as well.
That's
Okay,
good.
great. Awesome. So, man, we get more and more questions every week. And I think yesterday we touched on 4 of them. And it was a long conversation. So hopefully some of the questions that people have sent in, will be answered as we talk through and have this conversation, because they were similar in many ways. So, first question, although it's dark, I would like to hear your thoughts on the parallels between Canadian and American treatment of Indigenous people, from the separation of children from their parents, indoctrination/assimilation, and even forced sterilization, to what we're seeing now in the American treatment of refugees, specifically Hispanic populations that are detained in ICE centers. I, like many others, am enraged by it and the fact that governing officials are ignoring the horrific human rights violations that their predecessors committed. Do you think this is ignorance? No. Do you think this stems from the same malicious intent as it did when these atrocities were enacted on Indigenous peoples?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. So settler colonialism is not gone. It is not in the past.
Yeah.
So that's a really important thing to assert and to remember and to affirm. And what Dan brought up about the sort of like the Holocaust memory dissipation is part of that settler colonialism seeping in and making us forget or silencing those important voices and experiences. So like Canada and the US hold the same, in different ways, and Tanya will talk about this too, hold different ways of looking at the same product. And Matt Wildcat in episode 3 talked about this, right? This idea that like, though that the US and Canada came to civilizing in different ways, the outcome is the same, right?
Yeah.
So like Davin Flood, who is the architect of residential schools, looked to the US model of Indian residential schools and then brought it over. So like essentially wrote a guidebook saying, look how cheap this can be. We could make this happen. And it's really important to think that like back in that day, how Canadians, like citizens, were thinking, yes, this is good for Indigenous people because they can get all the tools and tricks and like all they need to be not emancipated, but to become enfranchised and become citizens. But it's like, it is not at all. So, and this is the lesson that we're going to learn today, right? But yeah.
In terms of, I know that we talk about language, or I've been bringing up language and the power and the importance of words over the course of these 5 weeks as well. The idea of civilized and the foundation of that word, I think so many people use that word not knowing where it came from, what it implies, and the historical context of it. I know I can admit to having used it without knowing what it implies. And I think there are so many people out there who have been using it under very sort of false or mixed up ideas of what the true definition of that word is. So just, as someone who likes to jump in every once in a while and pick apart the significance of words, civilized is certainly one that I have, over these lessons, really come to understand as being something that will never be used, particularly in my vocabulary ever again, unless it is within the context of this historical kind of conversation. But I just wanted to sort of pinpoint these things because I do think that shifting the way that people speak, realizing and being able to pinpoint when vocabulary has come from, a past that we are not even aware of. Revamping and catching ourselves in those moments helps to, in a way, kind of take that history out of our mouths and start to inform us in terms of how we can better articulate ourselves.
There's a lot of history. Oh, sorry about that. Do you want to go first?
No, I was just thinking words are so incredibly fascinating, Dan. And, I think if you were to ask a bunch of Cree elders or language experts, what's the Cree word for civilization? I would love to hear the answer. And I would love to think that Wakotowin, this idea of interdependency, interconnectedness, obligation, as opposed to rights or entitlement, your accountability, that's what would be connected with our idea of civilization, Wakotowin. It's the understanding that we're all connected rather than civilization as being what does that represent to us right now today? I think that's a whole other conversation, I know, but yeah.
I wanted to talk about the relationship between our system of residential schools and the German. The model of the extermination camps was modeled off of the residential school system here in Canada. There's who said the final solution first? Our government. Auschwitz, the first building where people were, their clothes and whatnot was removed from them. That building was called Canada. And so it's not something, there is close relationships between these ideas of atrocities and genocide. British colonialism, that it was extended to Australia. The idea of the manifest destiny from the US. All of these things are the dark side of humans. And how do we make sure that gets recognized for the awful thing that it is? People just want to wipe it under the rug, but we need to talk about these things.
It's a modern problem. This is a modern problem.
Yeah. There's that saying, ignorance is bliss, but I often wonder, bliss for who?
Yeah.
Certainly not Indigenous peoples, right? Yeah. Go ahead, Tanya.
I'm just looking at Jordan's principle as we were going into talking about Cindy Blackstock, and I really wanted to make sure that I gave a plug for Cindy Blackstock so that somebody can your class can take a look at that as a bigger issue. So Jordan's principle and looking at the how children today are being taken. More children are taken today and put into the social system than there was ever in the residential school system. So we're seeing a modern day tactic of genocide by the UN definition.
Yeah, that's a good point. Really good point, Tanya. Did you want to talk a little bit more about Cindy Blackstock and Jordan's principle in this context?
And who she is and stuff.
I'm seeing that somebody was adding to this discourse. I'm wondering if what other people are thinking about the idea of Jordan River Anderson, who was the man, the young man who was in the social system. So just to make clear, what happens with a kid or a human who's Indian, they're under federal watch for health. So they're wards of the federal state. But health system is under the provinces. So whenever something happens in regards to whose responsibility is it to take care of so people will die in that space in between. And Jordan's principle is named after Jordan River Anderson. And it's important to understand that there is that awful space where kids are not being taken care of, never mind any other Indigenous people.
And it's
People are
indicative.
dying. Yeah.
It's indicative too of the state not ever wanting to take care of, you know, their fiduciary duty to Indigenous treaties and to Indigenous, like, you know, responsibilities. They never wanted to in the first place. So this Jordan, her fight, Blackstock's fight for the last, 15 years has been against that recalcitrant, like, state not wanting to own up to its responsibilities. And that's just for, like, you know, people who have status. The people who are outside of the status, fiduciary duty, like, there's all these different layers of Indigenous peoples that the government should be owning up to their responsibilities, right? So
yeah, that landmark ruling in 2016, the Human Rights Tribunal that went to the against the federal government to stop applying a limited discriminatory definition of Jordan's principle, to take the whole meaning of the principle and the scope of the principle forward. And the federal government hasn't looked up to what was stated in the tribunal. Yes, Canada has an obligation to sorting this situation out, but the Canadian government is still not moving forward with this, and that's 2016.
yeah, we're still in court.
And we see millions of dollars going towards this fight, not to have this responsibility to Indigenous people and to the treaties. Millions of dollars in courts between the federal government and provincial governments fighting over who has to deal with the Indians. So it's ongoing.
So nutty.
Aaliyah also talked about human rights violations as it pertains to sterilization. And so in our chat yesterday about this, you know, it came up that forced sterilization happened in Canada, and it continues to happen around the world. In fact, in particular, if we want to contextualize this for Alberta, women of the famous five, which of course includes Emily Murphy, we have a park named after her, Nellie McClung, you know, here in Alberta, they were huge supporters and campaigners for Alberta's Sexual Sterilization Act that happened in 1928. These are first wave feminists that are often uplifted, all women of British descent, and they were sort of upheld, these women, as preservers and protectors of Anglo-Saxon race and of course Christian values. So at the time they were worried about increased immigration and then increased births as well amongst the unfit population, aka not white. And middle-class Canadians were worried about this. They were worried about race, you know, degeneration, so to speak. And Alberta was the only province that vigorously implemented the sterilization law in Canada. The Alberta Eugenics Board remained active actually until 1972. And for those of you that don't know, eugenics is this idea that like begets like, and degenerates procreating must be stopped at all costs. So we needed a specific kind of people to procreate. And that meant mostly Anglo-Saxon white Christians.
No half-breeds, boy.
No, not at all. And so we see Alberta sort of becoming famous in this realm of sterilization.
This idea of people prioritizing people and people's belief systems trumping other people's bodies and beliefs is just continues. I know this is not a new idea, nor is it a new sort of mental struggle, but I just, the more we keep talking about it, the more unbelievable it, I mean, it is believable, but how just unconscionable it is that somehow in the trajectory of life, humans have prioritized themselves over other humans to the point where they actually can implement physical boundaries on other people. It's just and it's happening. It continues to happen. It is just such an unbelievably dark and horrible human instinct. I don't even know how else to classify it, because it happens. It happens all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
So it has to be some kind. It's just it's something in the human species. It's a bizarre, terrible impulse that certain brains have, I suppose.
It's very different worldviews, definitely, you know.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But it has a lot to do with power, right? So like power really, sort of, it operationalizes all this sort of all of these aspects that we're talking about, right? Like it fuels genocide, right? And so those are like the overt sides of this erasure and forgetting and subordinating difference. Then I think about all the implicit things, and this is what is also equally as hurtful and dramatic, is like Senator Bayek is a senator here in Canada, in the Supreme something in Canada,
Ontario.
Ontario, that's right. And she's famous for denying the experience of residential schools, right? And it's such a simple thing, because her base and a lot of Canadians believe that, like, oh, day school was fine. Some people had good experiences. And I have a friend who had a great experience. And that could be true. Their experience is their experience. But the underlying problem is the racialization of education in residential schools, and what horrors that came from good people doing that. The Fabulous Five were trying to do good things, but when you look at it, you're like, why are you doing this? This is so inhumane. So that idea of power and like asserts itself in so many disgusting ways in our history. So we have to uncover it and remember.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, I remember a conversation that I had with Stephen Smith, who is part of the Show Up Foundation. And he was doing the work on Schindler's List, he and his brother. And they were talking about the industrial nature of genocide.
Yeah.
And those two have worked on a lot of the memorial sites, like Rwanda and South Africa. And I think that's an important thing to look at. And so the Shoah Foundation would talk about that sort of mechanization of genocide.
So yeah, big questions, big concepts to go through. And it's interesting how we feel the topic gets so heavy. It gets heavier and heavier. It's hard to bear. And so it's great to have these discussions with others. And for those of you that are listening, if you're feeling that rage or frustration, that incredible uncomfortability with our history, keep watching, and kudos to you for dealing with this difficult history and dealing with it together. Even when we're not together, it's you can see how it rests heavily on my colleagues and here. And so we're with you, and we'll work through this and talk more about it as we go along. So I had to interject my little firstborn big sister, Auntie, it's going to be okay. Just stick with us.
Don't leave.
Don't leave. Don't put your head in the sand. It does nobody no good. So Lorna asks and says, this has been very difficult lesson of videos to watch and material to read. Yes. I have a question with regard to a residential schooling part 2. In the video you state, quote, Métis children were often used as filler to fulfill the residential school's pupil quota in order to receive funds from Indian Affairs, and because they were seen as poor or living the Indian way of life, end quote. So a lot of Métis children attended residential schools, and of course their survivor experiences often mirrored First Nation survivors. So why did the Métis cultural abuse, why or how did the Métis cultural abuse differ? Why did you choose not to elaborate on the difference or offer explanations as to why this was the case? I'd like to understand an Indigenous perspective about this. And Tanya, you had a couple things to say about that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, initially we talked about the final report of the residential school, and of course the volume is multi-volumes and there's many books, and the Métis experience is just this little thin thing. I
It's
think
separated out.
well, there's many volumes of whatnot, but I think there could be more research on that. The government, the federal government, didn't really want Métis children in the school generally, because they were looking at, you know, getting rid of the First Nations people, and the Métis they thought was, you know, not such of a problem. Yeah, I know. And so, but they were more concerned about breaking the Indian and the forced assimilation. But there were Métis kids in there, and they were to fill quotas, or the parents wanted Métis children to actually go on and get an education. So there's complications in that further that, again, very personal.
Yeah. So Métis parents, you know, they wanted their children to be educated, you know. Did they want their experience in residential schools to be as it turned out to be? Obviously not. No one would want that for their children. But did they see Western education as sort of a way to improve their lives? Yes, they did. And like mentioned before, and we'll say it again and again, Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, could see these changes happening. And for the most part would be like, okay, we need to adapt. This is happening whether we want to or not. We need to adapt. This is education. If we educate our children in this way, perhaps there'll be a way that we can live in harmony, as the treaties talked about. But of course, we know the education that Indigenous children received in residential schools wasn't what anyone was expecting. It wasn't education at all, in the positive sense that we think about it. It was a means for assimilation and Christianization. So we indoctrinated Indigenous children to believe in individualization rather than kinship. You know, brothers and sisters were ripped apart, even though they were, you know, they depended on each other. So the genders were separated, which was completely opposite to how Indigenous worldviews are. They pushed the creation of nuclear families, where a male and a female and then had children, and then that was the nuclear family. There was no kinship past that. So there was marriage, children, and this is an indoctrination also, of course, into capitalism, where you're buying land and you're paying taxes to the government. So assimilation, absolutely, but they didn't they thought it was education in the way they understood education to be, the worldview that they thought. You're going to teach our children, you're going to teach them how, you know, to read and to how to do all of these things. They did not ever expect a whole indoctrination and of course into Christianity.
So then this is an interesting, like, so with Métis experience, there are multiple experiences, like every nation's experience, right? So the Métis, if you look deep into you see it in our modules, like the experience of road allowance when Métis, where they used to land and live with the land. As things got you know, bought up by settlers, Métis ended up with nowhere, you know, just like, so they weren't on reservations, they weren't in towns, right? So it's like this, there's that community that's kind of got dispossessed. But I want to also remember that, like, Métis also lived in villages across the prairies, and they experienced their own, you know, in sort of like implicit racism, you know, experiences of racism, right? So like, so Howard Adams is a really, you know, famous Métis scholar who's talked about the prison of grass, right? So like how like these things, settler colonialism happens in an overt way that happened to like children being scooped up and put into residential schools, but also in all sorts of different elements of white society, right? So, and what's interesting, and this goes back to what Tracy's saying, is that Christianity made this happen in relationship to the government. So it's just like government and Christian churches, doing it. The churches, Anglican, United, Presbyterian, and Catholic Church, did this because they volunteered for it. They saw it as a civilizational process to help Indians, right? Help brown people, right? Become better white people. Seriously, it's just that. And this is about power again. All of these things, like so much harm has happened to Indigenous children in these contexts because of power, because it's just like, you'll never be white enough. Therefore, you know, so this is where Métis sit in this, is that like, they're not brown enough or not white enough, because it's like we're being racialized by this system of power, this discourse around race, right? And for now, as Indigenous studies, the way we're framing this is like, we're going back to the nation to unpack this a little bit better, right? But Christianity has a really strong part in, you know, cisgender normativity, capitalism. You know, you work hard, you will be a better man for it, right? If the woman could just be in the house and make like good bread or something, have a good garden, take care of your small family. And that never really fit within the ethos of Indigenous engagement, right? So,
Right.
I think
To be clear though, Paul, just for principle, going with the federal government having their plan, it was them who did the framework, who created the terrible plan of this thing. It was the church that implemented.
exactly. Yep.
That's important to say.
The church is, right?
Churches, yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You know, even to speak generally just about the church and their involvement in genocide, I mean, across the board, I think this is also just from putting together, you know, doing research in other areas like the Magdalene laundries in Ireland, which also existed in Canada. There were laundries in Canada. And for those of you that don't know about the laundries, you can absolutely Google Magdalene laundries and the atrocities that happened there. But generally speaking, as it pertains to this, and, you know, and the laundries as another example, because it's a church-bound atrocity, or the church is attached to these injustices, I think, you know, from what I'm trying to piece together too, I think you're dealing with a wall that the church puts up, because a lot of people don't want to admit that their faith is tied to tragedy and genocide. And, you know, and the church in a lot of cases is not acknowledging these atrocities. So when you have the church not acknowledging the atrocities, you then don't have anyone who belongs to that church acknowledging those atrocities, which then creates another barrier between the truth and people's beliefs. And it's a really troubling thing, because I don't think there's anything wrong with the spirituality of religion, but obviously as a gay person, I have reservations with the belief system that continues to be perpetuated in society, that only a certain group of people are allowed into heaven, et cetera, and what the ripple effects of those beliefs. So just generally, it is, you know, as I was reading through this too, I just kept getting the churches, and this is not to necessarily come down on the church, but rather just acknowledge that the church, these churches have all been linked to really terrible things, and yet it is okay to be a member of a church and also understand that there have been injustices. And I think that's a barrier that needs to get broken down, because I think a lot of people out there who are very tied to their faith and tied to their church find it almost impossible to reconcile the terrible things that happened with their own beliefs. And the reality is, you have the freedom to separate yourself and see the truth as it relates to your own beliefs. It doesn't make you any less of a Christian to understand and acknowledge that parts of your religion, people who have been terrible ambassadors to your religion, have done terrible things. So that to me was like an alarming kind of consistency throughout history, that the church has really facilitated so much of these tragedies in the name of.
Oh man, that's so well put, Dan. Absolutely well said. And this whole idea that that you have to make a choice between your faith or, you know, and your religion, and understanding and believing and having empathy and the history that your church had. I think we should throw that out. It's not black and white. You don't have to choose one or the other. What you should be able to choose is truth, and find the truth, and looking at all perspectives, opening your eyes.
I'd like to tell a story about that too. My grandmother, my grandmother, she wanted to make sure she had her bases covered. So, you know, she had a traditional elder at her funeral. She made arrangements for an Anglican minister, and then a Christian, a Catholic person. So it was so funny because the elder got to speak first, and then the Anglican, and the Catholic priest was so pissed off about this. He said, "Yeah, like he said." So she had all her bases covered. She was going to heaven no matter where.
I love it.
Going
Kim Tallbear talks about Indigenous capacity to hold multiple truths. And that's something important to forward here, you know, and how like settler colonialism asserts a certain exclusivity that really it speaks to power, right? But this your relative's experience is really how Indigenous people are. They hold multiple truths and still stay true to themselves, you know.
Yeah,
well, it's part of the belief in a god or a Manitou. It's all the same for
just flowing up, you know.
A person. I mean, there's atrocities, yes, that were brought in by the church, but the faith in an higher being has always been there. So,
right on.
Yeah, an elder once told me that that faith and spirituality and religion is like this big wagon wheel, and that all the spikes, I don't know what you call them, spokes lead to this higher power, to that higher being, and it's how you get there. But the difference I think in spirituality and religion is spirituality is held anywhere, and you are embodying the values and actions rather than just speaking them and outlining the rules of things, you know.
Yep.
I mean, that's the simplest way. I'm thinking of it very simply, but it's complex. But that's how I've been taught to think about it. You know.
You bet.
I think it's pretty simple too. But
why make it hard, right?
Right. But in a First Nation component, I think it's like, who needs the middleman?
Who needs the middleman? That's right.
Marry the middleman, okay? Just make them kin.
That's right.
So when we were chatting yesterday, I keep having this thought that keeps bubbling up in this time of COVID. And this idea, you know, I've got a sister in New York who's, was debating whether to send her son to school. And of course, parents all over Canada are like grappling with this. COVID's rising in some schools here in Alberta and across Canada. And I just keep relating to this outrage that parents have of, you know, and frustration, anger, fear, of course, very much so. Of sending their child to school because of this danger. And I can't help but think of how Indigenous parents and grandparents thought about the dangers of maybe sending their kids to school. And when we're thinking, okay, we've got the masks, we've got this and all of these protocols in place to keep our kids safe, how were these parents supposed to keep their kids safe when they never came home? Half of them didn't come home. They were buried in the back of the residential school. And I know I'm making a huge leap here, but all of these parents who have this fear and frustrations, can you possibly relate to how these Indigenous parents might have felt? Not even having a choice, you could go to jail. No one's being threatened with jail here in Canada. If you don't send your kids to school, you have these choices, which is amazing in 2020. You have these choices. But I'm always trying to make these connections to create empathy, you know, and understanding.
I mean, I to that point, I mean, there are marches even in Canada from anti-maskers, from people who are telling, you know, who are expressing that you don't have a right to tell me how to wear a mask. I mean, that's a whole other conversation. But to your point, you know, people are, I mean, imagine getting to a point where the biggest concern you have is the freedom of wearing or not wearing a mask, as it pertains to what you were saying. We're looking within the past 100 years, within the past 40 years of a system where your children were taken from you without consent, and people now are complaining about wearing a mask for the potential well-being of other people. I mean, that to me is a sobering contrast in terms of privilege and in terms of understanding how lucky people are right now for that to be their biggest concern. I mean, this lesson, I think, should illuminate in so many people, parents and non-parents, just how the context of their lives and their freedoms.
So, you know, with being a citizen or being a good human being from an Indigenous worldview comes with obligations. And for a Western worldview, it comes with entitlements.
And freedom, yeah.
Good point, Tracy. Yeah.
Hola.
Ole.
Ole.
You know,
I want Dan to start talking like us, Paul. I want him to say, ole.
Ole, man.
Ever. Okay. So Jillian has two questions. She's talking about the reports of RCAP, which of course is the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and MMIWG, which is Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Commission. They're very important, and the many initiatives to teach them, learning from them, and implement them deserve support. Can we talk a little bit about the ways Indigenous people have taken up these findings within Indigenous ways of knowing and being? Like she wants to know about Idle No More and Walking with Our Sisters.
Yeah.
So in talking about this, you know, it wasn't the government's really lack of response that initiated these sort of things. I think if we talk especially about Idle No More, which was started by 4 women, 3 Indigenous and 1 ally in 2012, this was a grassroots movement unlike we've ever seen. And it was a response to the Harper government's Bill C-45, which was, you know, laws and legislation which was hell-bent on eroding treaty and Indigenous rights. So this was a grassroots movement that started from the government, not their lack of doing something, but they're doing something. And so they wanted to respond to that, right? So their mission statement was called on all people, not just Indigenous people, all people to join a revolution in honoring and fulfilling Indigenous sovereignty, which protects land and water. And remember, Dan, we were talking about that idea of protesters and language and, you know, land protesters, water protesters, as compared to water protectors and land protectors, right? And so they did this through what, you know, Paul is always talking about within these kinship connections and communities. This is what grassroots, you know, really is.
Yeah.
And that happened with Walking with Our Sisters. It was way before the government ever initiated a commission to talk about this. And Christy Belcourt, a famous Métis artist who we've talked about before, she just was like, what is happening with our Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit queer? Like, they're disappearing. And if it was any other section of Canada, if we had children between the ages of 15 and 16, all disappearing, there would be a huge uproar. We would be doing something about it. So she was the one that initiated this, and she was the one from the ground up, you know, with community, had this force across Canada for 7 years, never funded by anyone else but the people, never funded by oil and gas. And so these were things that were initiated by Indigenous people, and really want to highlight the resiliency and power that comes through kinship and community.
And can I say too, the sage that Tracy burns is from that movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
From those kinship connections, really important.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So we see that the government drags their feet all the time. Is it that they're not taking things seriously? We look at the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Commission that had their final report 2 years ago, 1 year ago. What's happened from that? I don't think, for the most part, we can rely on that kind of government support right now, current state as it is, to do things. We have to rely on our communities, our kinship relations. And the thing that Paul's saying is that for Indigenous people, our kinship relations doesn't just end if you're Indigenous or not. Like, we have the capacity to open up our arms and hold this circle for everyone. An elder once said that there's no closets in a teepee, and that we don't waste people, that everyone has a purpose and everyone has a reason. And so, we do get a lot of questions about, well, what can I do as an ally? What can I do as a settler? And again, we usually have the same response: educate yourself. It's not up to us to educate you. It's been really amazing sitting here and discussing these, modules with Dan and having our special guests, but that's not where it can end for you. Definitely not. So Tanya, do you have any thoughts on what our allies or settler people can do in Canada?
So first of all, taking a look at the no closets and the teepee, I can't Kent Monkman and his crystal chandelier teepee. Yeah, it's a beautiful piece. But if you don't know Kent Monkman's work, I recommend taking a look at it.
Mm-hmm.
Acknowledgement is great for people to do. It's a matter of acknowledging what's happening with First Nations people. But how do you do that? That's the question that a lot of people are asking, and a lot of non-Indigenous people are asking. Take a look at the 95 TRC's 95 calls to action. Take a look at that. There's a lot of resources you can take a look, but personally, ask yourself personally, what can you do? Not asking someone who's Indigenous what you can do. Mm-hmm. Look inward. Mm-hmm. And find out what you can do, because the skill set in each individual human being is quite different. What do you have to give to the cause? So I'd like to make that challenge to anybody who's out there thinking about what you can do.
Thank you, Tanya. Hey, Paul, what do you got to say there?
Decolonization's not a metaphor. Yeah, for sure. I love it. I think it's funny because it's absolutely true. And I love these talks because it's I love hearing Tanya and Tracy and all your insights into this thing that we have to do together and on our own, right? Yeah. So this Tuck and Yang wrote this really great article, and I don't know if we talked about it before, but decolonization is not a metaphor. And read it very carefully, because it's a great systematic kind of analysis and call to action, just like the TRC, right? That this is not a metaphor. It's not something that you can do on your own without any source of engagement, without any knowledge, without any experience, right? This isn't abstract. This is real, right? So, yeah. And just to say, go and read that and say, I think we'll touch on this later, but the real issue really is give land back to Indigenous people. And what does that mean in a kinship-based understanding and not a possessive way of understanding.
Mm.
Do that soul searching and understand what that means. I don't want your pool, you know, like it's just like, it don't matter. You know, we just Indigenous peoples in all their different ways want their relations back. And all of this nonsense, this settler nonsense, is about breaking up those relations. So we'll talk about UNDRIP later on, and and TRC are connected. These are inspired documents made by Indigenous collective engagement, right?
Yeah.
So,
I love you, Paul.
ah! Oh, I love Tanya. It's so much fun.
Yeah. We had a lot of questions about this idea of reconciliation thrown to the wayside as soon as it's inconvenient. Aaliyah says, as most seen recently with the Wet'suwet'en water protectors and the RCMP presence, provincial bill making their protests illegal. Is there anything in Canada that's doing well towards reconciliation? And other than voting accordingly and donating to causes and organization, she wants to know what are the actionable items that everyday Canadians. So, you know, we've answered a lot of that question, and I think it's important. And we have a colleague you guys haven't seen yet named Sarah, and she says in our conversation, she said, it is a question that does once again center settlers. And she said, supporting and standing with land and water protectors is super important. Voting accordingly, of course, standing up for Indigenous people online and face-to-face. And as I mentioned last week, when I got a little emotional, and I encourage everyone to watch the documentary by Tasha Hubbard, We Will Stand Up. I said that after Gerald Stanley was acquitted with murder, and I went out in public, I never felt so hated because of my race in my entire life. I felt it like needles, you know, death from 1,000 cuts. And that's me, this strong Indigenous woman who can, you know, physically and mentally defend myself, spiritually, I guess, too. What about all those that don't have that capacity or ability or knowledge of that, or articulate, you know? So me feeling hated was a huge slap in the face. And but anyway, stand with us, educate yourselves as you're doing now. It's about standing up and standing with Indigenous people to push back against this vitriol of settler Canadian and settler colonialism. Actively seeking information like many of you are, and educating yourselves. You can't put your head in the sand about these issues. You just can't, and then complain about the situation. So take your blinders off and really look inwardly about who you are, where you're placing yourselves, as you know, Dan has done, because it's complicated, but it's not undoable.
Mm-hmm.
That's so true, and I do think that it is. We have so many people out there, I think, whether they want to admit it or not, whether they even see it or not, have been culturally conditioned to expect things to come easy to them. And it's exactly what you were saying, which is ask yourself the question, am I making myself the center of this narrative? And if you realize that you are, then recontextualize it, dismantle it, and put it back together. Whatever you're concerned about, whatever you're questing for in terms of either activism or knowledge, it is unfortunately something that has just been pounded into people, this entitlement. And you know, certainly for me through this entire process, I think that's where it's why I'm connecting so many dots through these courses, because I think empathy, understanding, and the connectivity of people's struggles, you can find points of relation in your own life that will help for you to access a lot of that empathy and to see things clearer in terms of saying, okay, how do we think about this as a whole, and how am I related to it? Because I think for so long, communities that have been put through intense amount of persecution or tragedy are isolated communities. And as a culture, we almost feel like there's this protective bubble where people can't access other people's communities or other people's lives. And the reality is that we are all so much more connected than we ever thought. It's just about accessing those points of relation and realizing that some of us who have not been put through the same amount of struggle or trauma have work to do in terms of allyship and in terms of aligning ourselves as supportive people who can be there and work to move things forward and repair as best we can. So that's,
I'd like to talk about the residential school exhibit at the Royal Alberta Museum.
Yes.
That was a project I worked on for 7 years. And being on the advisory panel, the Indigenous Advisory Panel, I've been on that committee since 2001. But a lot of the people around me were elders. And when it was asked who was going to put this show together, I was looking at elders and like, oh, well, I shouldn't say anything. It's the curator. She was going to quit. Nobody could talk about it. And then I realized everyone stepped back and I was the person left standing. And I went, yeah, it's me that I have to talk about. This is the last job I wanted to talk about residential schools. So and I made sure my name wasn't on anything. How do you make sure that you're addressing all the people who are going to go in that exhibit? The people who are former residential school students, and I prefer the term former residential school students rather than victims or survivors, because that boxes them in two things, but there's much more happening there. But what happens when white grandmas come in or little kids that are coming in their tours? It had to be something that it could address everybody. And that was really hard. It was a really hard thing to do. And the first year I could barely even move. Yeah. So thinking about aspects like a map in there was a map where I was giving a lecture on it, and there was this map on the wall that I was showing in this discussion. And when you're doing a lecture, you don't expect anyone to come up, but there was a man who just jumped out of the audience of 50, and he ran up and he pointed his, not even knowing that anyone was there. It was just tunnel vision. He just went, "That's where I went to school." And he put his finger on the board and on the wall. And then another person who was non-Aboriginal came up and he says, "This is where I lived, and I didn't even know there was a school here." And so that still happens in the museum. This big map was important for both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal to identify place and time and discuss that. And there was a lot of things that I just appreciated doing. And I would strongly recommend to go see it. Alex Janvier is the star of the space. He talks about his experience in residential school, and there is a video of him talking about Blood Tears, a painting that he had made that on the backside indicates all of the experiences that he had in residential school. Yeah, so if you have a chance to go see it, please do.
Yeah.
Is it virtual yet, Tanya, or is there plans to have it virtual, or do you have to see it in person?
I think you still have to see it in person. Yeah. But it'll be up for 10 years or something like that. So.
Oh, fantastic.
And it's powerful. It is powerful.
Yeah.
Tanya.
Yeah.
Well, it's not my voice. It's not my voice.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, providing the platform for voices is also really important too, right? That's hard work, and it's important work.
You know what I found, which was interesting about the format, because I was really looking at the architecture of the space, of the design of the place, and it's in a circle. Yep. And with Alex's painting, when you go around the painting, so you can see what some of the discussion is, it's tight. It's a tight little space, and Aboriginal people will go back there, and then some of them are crying. They're former students. And then there is non-Aboriginal people who come, and because it's a circle, everyone kind of lines up. And I find non-Aboriginal and Aboriginal people in there at the same time, and they just are both reading. They don't even see each other, which is a fabulous thing that I didn't expect to happen. Yeah.
Must be powerful. I'll have to go and see that. I haven't at all.
And Dan will have to come and see it.
I can come visit.
I'll go with you. I'll go with you.
Please,
Personal.
I will make that a first trip when we travel is not.
Yeah.
First trip is to Edmonton.
Field trip.
That's right. So I've got a couple things before we end today. I want to give a bonus question to people because Paul mentioned we're going to be talking about UNDRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. And the bonus question is, who were the last 4 countries to sign UNDRIP and why? That will give you something to think about, most definitely. So I have to, we do get a lot of questions and comments like, what are the events and what are things we're doing? And we always try to tell you guys some of the resources, the films that we're doing, some art. So, you know, there's been mention of Kent Monkman, aka Miss Chief Eagle Testicle, Tuck and Yang, Alex Janvier, Howard Adams. So all of these things will be on a link for resources. But I just want to mention a couple of events if you want to come celebrate with us. These are all virtual events going on at the U of A. And so the Faculty of Native Studies is putting on a powwow, so to speak. Dan, have you ever been to a powwow?
I have not.
Oh,
Wow.
what's the first things for you?
You gotta get a taco in a bag.
Yeah, do that.
Taco in a bag.
Taco in a bag.
You're missing out, man.
I'm listening.
There's a powwow, and it's a virtual celebration. And so what you do, you get to come on, you register, you get to learn about the women and men's fancy dance styles, stories about the regalia, like the outfits that they wear. They're not costumes. And you get to choreograph your own powwow dance steps.
Oh,
So
no way.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's
There's a
awesome.
live dance demonstration as well, and drumming. So everyone's welcome. And it's on-demand video available September 21st to 30th, and we'll have the link up as well. And
Wow.
Paul, you also, you got me onto this book. It's Jessie Thistle's book, From the Ashes. And so there's a virtual launch of this that's happening as well. And we'll put the link on with that. And our very own Dr. Paul Garreau, what are you doing with this?
I they asked me for some weird reason to have like a conversation with Jesse about his book for their book launch, which is, Jesse's book is about homelessness, but it's about relationships and what is Indigenous home, right? So it is an incredible book.
Paul?
That's taking place on Sunday, I'm reading it, to September 27th at 2 to 3 p.m. MST or MDT.
Yeah,
Okay.
you have to register.
So we'll be sure to share as much of this as possible so that everyone can join in.
It'll be a fun conversation. I'll talk about his mom and how beautiful she is in the book.
It's an audio book too. It's beautiful, and it's read by Jesse. It's really amazing. So I think I want to give the opportunity for Tanya, if there's anything else that you want to share with us before we go and sign off. Having you here has been such a great pleasure, and sharing your wisdom and things with us. So thank you.
Oh, I think that you guys are doing a great job, and it's been a pleasure to have me visit. It's been a blast. It's nice to be on this Indigenous View show. Thank you for having me come. That's great.
Oh, awesome.
Thanks, Whoopi.
Tanya, really.
Any last words, Dan?
You know, I know that we only really kind of just skimmed the surface of all the questions that came in, and you know,
Right.
even in terms of conversations that we had in our little pre-chat yesterday, there was so much we didn't even get to. So, you know, I'm in my head trying to think of ways that we can come back to this so that we can continue to have these conversations, potentially a part 2. Maybe we can kind of like do a little extra week or an extra video that we can put up on the site so that we can continue to have these conversations, because I know that so many people out there were so affected by the stories, the information, the history, and you know, obviously these discussions are intended to help expand on the lesson, and to kind of, you know, dimensionalize and kind of lift the words off the page and give people some stories behind the learning. So, you know, with everyone's you know, agreeance, potentially we'll continue this conversation, because you know, it's hard to reduce it to an hour conversation when there is so much more to be said. So let's hope that we can. Okay, we're getting thumbs up. We can continue this. Let's. Okay, so look for a part 2, and we will, you know, keep those questions and hopefully upload something when this is all done, to kind of be an add-on to this really important conversation.
Yeah,
Cool.
absolutely. I'm just quickly trying to go like, what are we doing next? What's happening next? So bear
Next.
with me. Yeah, next week. Just wanted to say, let's see. Oh yes, that's right. Lesson 6, a modern Indian ? And we have our guest, Dr. Nicole Lugosi, will be with us next week. So we are so blessed to have everyone. And Tanya, thank you again for being on here. It's been fabulous. And
You're
yeah,
awesome.
I love these view shows. Indigenous
Me too.
View. Fall.
Thank you to everyone for tuning in and watching us, and hope you took something really kind of meaningful from the discussions today, because I certainly did. Thank you to
Excellent.
everyone, and we will see you all next week.
Bye.